As we continue our discussion of friction in the labor markets, let's take another look, closer look at the results of friction, again using these concepts of surplus and thinking about wage floors, wage ceilings, and possibly even some labor quotas. Let's assume for a moment that a wage floor has been imposed exogenously on a marketplace. Perhaps this is a minimum wage. That would certainly be above today's minimum wage. And so it might make sense to us. And it would clearly be a wage floor above that minimum wage, so wage floor at 8 1/4. And there's two things we can see that this is going to do very quickly. One, it's going to motivate some mismatch between labor demanded and labor supplied because of the imposition of this wage. So let's go ahead and think about what that might look like. So let's say for labor demand, we have 20 minus 8 1/4, the new wage, which is going to equal then 11.75. So we have a labor demand prime of 11.75. And for labor supply, we're similarly simply going to put that new wage into the labor supply equation. So negative 10 plus 3 times 8.25. And we can easily see the 3 times 8.25 is 24.75 minus 10, so we're left with 14.75. So that would be a labor supply prime at 14.75. And we now know that we have labor supply minus labor demand equals some number of unemployed, or we have 14.75 minus 11.75 is going to now leave us with 3 unemployed individuals or workers in this marketplace. We had 0 unemployment because all of our supply was consumed by demand, such that we had 0 unemployment when we had this market clearing or equilibrating level. And now with this imposition of 8 1/4 minimum wage, without changing the supply curve, without changing the demand curve, would look, at least initially, like we have some level of unemployment. That is the classic concern about changes in the minimum wage. It may or may not be founded, as we'll talk about later on in one of the other segments, but in fact, in this case, this is how we can think about this, this concern. Well, we also like to be able to look at the changing or changed levels of employer surplus and worker surplus. We can very quickly see that employer surplus now is simply smaller. It was this larger triangle, and now it's going to be a smaller triangle with the same definitions above the price of labor being paid, so above the wage, below the labor demand curve, and bounded by whatever our quantity is. We're using labor demand as our quantity rather than labor supply because this is going to be the number of workers that are actually working. Firms are the demanders of labor, and the only people working are the ones that are going to be hired by the firm as a function of the labor demand equation. So we're only going to have 11.75 workers. So you can immediately see that not only do we motivate some level of unemployment, but we also decrease the number of workers that are getting a wage. It used to be 12.5, and now it's only 11.75. So there is 0.75 workers that have no wage, no surplus. So their worker surplus is reduced, and there's 0.75 workers worth of production and productivity that employers aren't going to be able to benefit from. So we can see very quickly a couple of other forms come about here. We see that where we had a larger employer surplus, this entire large triangle, it's now this small triangle, and now we can see that worker surplus, the area of worker surplus has changed altogether, such that it would be not only the blue shaded area, but also the area that I have here, but we're going to be then exempting this part, down at this part of the blue triangle here, such that our worker surplus is just this area, and we now have some new area to think about that we will call deadweight loss. Because this is some surplus we used to have, and now we don't. And so that's going to give us some reduction in overall surplus, total surplus, because of this realignment, or if you will, misalignment between employer and worker surplus. In order to be able to get the values that we might like to get to calculate the new employer surplus and worker surplus, there's another value that we're going to have to identify on our graphic, and is the value right here. It's a value that lets us identify the area of a small triangle and the area of a rectangle. And the way that we're going to get that value is by taking this 11.75 value of workers and putting it into the labor supply curve. So we'll do it as such. 11.75 is equal to negative 10 plus 3W, because what we're looking for is this value on the W axis. Well, that would then be 21.75 being equal to 3W, or 21.75 divided by 3 being equal to W. W being equal to 7.25 now. And with that value, we can go ahead and think about how we value then both employer surplus and worker surplus, which will be the sum of this rectangle and this small triangle. And then we'll think about this other small triangle that has arisen for us as deadweight loss. So you can see here that I've gone ahead and imposed these values that I've referenced, imposed these shapes and areas that I've referenced. Now let's go about calculating them. So employer surplus will be equal to our base, now 11.75, times our height, which is going to be 20 minus 8.25, and then all of that divided by 2, which, as it turns out in this case, is 11.75 times 11.75 divided by 2, which is 69.03. So that's our employer surplus. Recognize here that this is the second example in which we've seen that the base times the height for employer surplus was the same. That is strictly coincidental based upon the formation of this labor demand curve. Don't expect that you'll see that repeatedly. It's possible to see it, but it's unusual to see it repeatedly. It just so happens, based upon the nature of this labor demand curve having a slope of -1, if you will, that we're seeing that. Well, how do we calculate the worker surplus then? Let's go ahead and think about the value of this rectangle and then the value of this triangle. Well, the value of the rectangle is probably the easier part. Let's start with that. The value of the rectangle is the base of 11.75 times its height, which is the difference between 8.25 and 7.5, so that would be 7.5, plus then the base of 11.75 times then the height of this triangle. Well, the height of 7.25 minus 3 1/3, 7.25 minus 3 let's call it 334. That would be 3.91. Let's just confirm that. 7.25 minus 3.334, so 3.91. And then divide that by 2. I see that I have an error in this rectangle. It's not 0.75. It should be 1. It's the difference between 8.25 and 7.25. That's the height of our rectangle. So that's 1. So this is going to leave us with 11.75 plus 11.75 times 3.91 divided by 2, or 22.97, or that will give us a worker surplus of 11.75 plus 22.97, or 34.72. Well, how do we think about then the value of this deadweight loss? There's a couple of different ways of doing it. We can actually go ahead and calculate it because we have a base and we have a height that we can think about, or we can think about it as being the difference between a new total surplus, or the difference between our total surplus before and the sum of this employer surplus, we'll call it prime now, and worker surplus prime. Well, what would be the sum of those? 69.03 plus 34.72 is going to be 103.75. And then if we subtract that from 104.19, that was our original total surplus, then we get a value of 0.4. Let's see if we can find some close approximation of that value of 0.44 by simply creating the value for this triangle. Well, the value for the triangle, we'll come over here and use this space. The value for the triangle will be base times height divided by 2. And here we have a base of 0.75. So this is our deadweight loss triangle. 0.75 times our height. The height will be 8 1/4 minus 7 1/4, which then is just 1. And that divided by 2, or that's going to equal 0.75 divided by 2. So 0.75, 2 divided, is going to give us 0.375. That's a little bit different than the 0.44 that we thought of a moment ago, but only a little bit, and that's because of a rounding error difference in how we have used the second decimal point rather than out to a third, fourth, or fifth. So here we're going to find that the employer surplus prime plus worker surplus prime plus deadweight loss will then become roughly equal to our original total surplus, because that is total surplus. The ES prime plus WS prime plus deadweight loss, you can see, is the total surplus that we have for this, and is going to be the same area as the original total surplus. So let's think about this, and we can see once again here how I've calculated this. Only in my calculations now I have slightly different value here because of rounding issues, which gave me a slightly different value in deadweight loss. Once again, they're going to equal together the total surplus that we had initially. Now let's think about how this might look if we have a wage ceiling instead of a wage floor. Well, a wage ceiling, of course, we know is going to represent itself below W star. Let's call it 6.5. So we have a wage ceiling of 6.5. And again, this might be motivated by some attempt to suppress wages. Maybe they've risen too high. Maybe they've motivated inflation, what have you. And we're using the exact same metrics now, the exact same tools we used before, but we're using them on a slightly different area of the marketplace, of our market model. And now we once again have a mismatch between labor supply and demand, only it's just the opposite now, where we have labor supply, where we have to think about what that value is going to be, and labor demand, we'll think about what its value is going to be. So labor supply, then in this case, will equal negative 10 plus 3 times 6.5. Well, 3 times 6.5 will be 19.5 minus 10, so 9.5. And so this is going to be a value of 9.5. And labor demand will become now 20 minus this new wage of 6.5, or 20 minus 6.5 is equal to 13.5, which we'll see here. So now we have a demand that is greater than the supply, which leads to some shortage. And that's, again, problematic for us because it's also going to distort our employer surplus and worker surplus. Now it's worker surplus that gets very small because the wage has come down and the worker doesn't get as much wage, but the employer now receives some extra value, extra benefit that maybe they weren't receiving before, and it looks like employer surplus is going to become much larger, and we're going to see some deadweight loss. And as we've seen before, deadweight loss is not beneficial to the economy. It represents some surplus that we could have had there not been this intervention, but now we simply can't have it because of the intervention. And we can go ahead and value these just as we valued them before. The values here will be just a little bit different. And we don't even have to calculate those. You can see them, and you saw how we did the calculations on the prior model. But you'll see here that employer surplus is larger, and that we would want to find some value here so that we could identify the value of this triangle, and then separately this now enlarged rectangle. And we already have the value here, here, and here to value our new smaller worker surplus. So let's go ahead and actually identify this value just so that you're very clear as to how we're going to get it. We know that we have a number of labor units required of 9.5, and that's going to then be reacting with the labor demand curve. So we'll use the labor demand relationship, or 9.5 is going to be equal to 20 minus W, or we're going to have 20 minus 9.5, so we have W will be equal to 10.5. And that then will be here. And with that value, we can now calculate this triangle. We can calculate this rectangle, this whole rectangle here, part of which used to be worker surplus. This is going to give us a new value for employer surplus, a much smaller value for worker surplus, and we then have this deadweight loss, which now is going to be base of 3 times height of 4. So 3 times 4, or 12, divided by 2, deadweight loss is going to be 6. So this wage ceiling imposition actually was more detrimental to the economy, significantly so, than the wage floor that we might have seen, because we had a deadweight loss here of 6, whereas we only had a deadweight loss here of 0.38, or in our earlier calculation, 0.44, because of rounding issues. So this is how we think about the changes in this market for wage ceilings and wage floors. Let's look finally at a labor quota and what the labor quota might do to us. Here I've suggested a labor quota of 15. So a labor quota of 15, that's a large labor quota. That's going to be way out here. So that's going to be beyond our original number of labor units. So this gives us kind of a different thought here. We have to think about there is no change in employer surplus immediately. There is no change in worker surplus immediately, but there is this labor quota that gives us something to be concerned about. Well, if we think about it, if we're expecting there to be 15 workers supplied to the marketplace, and if that's beyond our L star, we're going to have to find a way to motivate these workers. So it looks to me like we're going to have to pay them something beyond W star. And that then is going to extend our concept of worker surplus. And worker surplus then will become this area perhaps. And so we know that we can value that worker surplus if we know this value here. So to know that value, it is going to be a value that is interacting with the labor supply curve when the labor is 15. So let's use the labor supply curve. Let's say labor supply is equal to 15, and that's equal to 10 plus 3W, or 25 is equal to 3W, or 25 divided by 3 is equal to the wage, and that would be 8.33. So W is equal to 8.33. Well, if this were the situation that arose, that the labor quota is at 15, and we had to motivate the labor supply relation to get that, we don't expressly see a deadweight loss arise. We see some additional worker surplus arise that couldn't have been there before. It was impossible for this area of worker surplus to present itself earlier. We'll kind of overlay it like this so you can see it more clearly perhaps. And so where is this going to be funded from? Well, in this case, the body that exogenously imposed this quota of 15, forcing this wage of 8.33, is going to have to find a way to benefit the employer that is losing some surplus and that's having to pay this additional wage. So there's going to be some kind of a policy that puts people to work. The employer's got to pay for it, but for the employer to agree to this policy, the government probably is going to have to step in and be willing to give some benefit to the employer to help them afford that. So this is how we're going to look at the results of friction and how we might like to think about surpluses in this labor market.